conservative and liberal Christians like to argue about who's more of a true Christian. The liberals feel like the conservatives make Christianity look bad by being bigoted, and the conservatives feel like the liberals don't take the faith seriously because they don't follow Christian beliefs. But it's not an either-or. It's more of a spectrum, and at the heart of it, it doesn't have anything to do with politics. It actually has to do with how they see the faith differently. The more theologically conservative you are, the more narrow a view you have of who counts as true Christian, until the most conservative people are like, if you don't agree with me on every little thing, you're going to hell. And the most progressive people are like, yeah, even if you don't believe in God, you can still be a Christian because you can't judge people. So where's the middle of the spectrum? Well, it changes, and it's all relative based on historical circumstance, but these days the dividing line seems to be the question of whether pastors can be women. Let's move to stage 1. Stage 1 progressivism is called Christian guilt. Progressive Christianity begins with the idea that Christianity needs to change or progress, and the only reason it would need to progress is if it's been bad historically. It starts with believing the modern accusations that Christianity has contributed to injustice and oppression. So stage 1 progressives identify as Christian but feel a bit uneasy about Christianity. If you are a Christian and you have positive feelings about Christianity, then congrats, you're just a normal Christian. If you're not Christian and don't have positive feelings about Christianity, then you're a regular non-Christian. But if you are Christian and still don't have positive feelings about Christianity, that's the first stage to being a progressive Christian. So if you hear certain Christians talk about deconstructing more conservative forms of Christianity, or trying to separate themselves from conservative Christians more than separating themselves from non-Christians, that often is the groundwork for the rest of progressive Christianity. So stage 1 thinks the church needs to change, which causes stage 2 to have a disordered focus. This applies to many mainline Protestant churches that still believe the Christian faith on paper, but chances are it's not what you're going to hear preached on a Sunday morning. Instead, they're going to talk about things like social justice. You're a lot more likely to hear them talk about earthly matters like the environment or politics or racial justice than things like sin, salvation, and heaven, even if they still technically believe in those things. So stage 2 still believes the Bible, but stage 3 is when you get to scripture denial, where they challenge the Bible's authority, especially on matters of gender and sexuality. They'll still use the Bible, but they think it can be wrong. So when you have LGBTQ affirming churches, that's an example of this. They're also usually universalist, or at least implicitly universalist, because these churches will still believe in Jesus, but think that there's also other paths to God. Since the Bible has Jesus clearly talking about hell and saying he's the only way to salvation, a church kinda has to deny the authority of Scripture to be universalist, which they often do. Stage 3 removes Scripture as a foundation, which leads to stage 4, which is explicit heresy. This is where people expand their view of what Christianity is so wide it goes well beyond the bounds of Nicene orthodoxy. The Nicene Creed is an early church document that said what Christianity is. It includes basic beliefs like the Trinity, that Jesus rose from the dead, that Jesus is God, and the virgin birth. But heresy is when people begin to question all of these things. People in this stage will say things like, it doesn't matter if Jesus really rose from the dead historically, what matters is that it inspires us to do social justice and reconciliation. So for people in this stage, Christianity is really not a system of beliefs. It's just a community of faith, not faith in any specific belief, but a common commitment to social justice. Now, people in stage 4 still believe in God in some sense, but people in stage 5 are essentially agnostic. This applies to a lot of Unitarian Universalists who literally do not believe in God, so the only difference between them and actual atheists is they at least think religion can be useful in some sense, whereas regular atheists generally don't. They don't really see God as a being that actually objectively exists. Rather, they ask, how can the idea of a loving God inspire us to do social justice? But for them, basically everything about Christianity is metaphorical. Well, those are the stages of progressive Christianity. Now let's talk about the degrees of conservative Christianity. I think it makes sense to call the levels of progressivism stages, because progressive Christianity is, well, progressive. Meaning that if someone's at all on the progressive side of the spectrum, they're very likely to keep moving, or progressing, in a progressive direction. But it makes sense to call the levels of conservatism degrees, because if someone's somewhere on the conservative side, they're not necessarily going to move in one direction or the other. Also, the degrees of conservatism are less about what you actually believe and more about what you're willing to tolerate in the church. For example, the first degree of conservatism is where you're not only against female pastors, but you think any church with a female pastor is a false church. Because there are some more moderate conservatives who are like, yeah, I don't support female pastors, but if a church has one, it's not the end of the world. But no, in this degree, you think that if a church has a female pastor, it shows that the church is not following the Bible at all and therefore cannot be trusted as a legitimate church. The second degree of conservatism is where you think biblical inerrancy is non-negotiable. The church has always seen the Bible as infallible, which means we can't question the Bible, and we must obey the Bible's authority on all matters of faith and practice. However, inerrant means something different. Inerrant means the original manuscripts of the Bible have no detail errors at all and no inconsistencies. This kind of developed in reaction against some of the more liberal views of Scripture. So if someone says, I think the Bible's infallible, but it might have some detail errors, these people are going to be like, shut up, liberal! The third degree of conservatism is where you're strictly a young earth creationist. Some Christians think the 6 days of creation in Genesis 1 might represent something else, and other Christians think the earth was created in 6 literal 24-hour days around 6,000 years ago. Both of these views have existed throughout all of church history, but people in this degree think that young earth creationism is the only acceptable view, and Christians must not believe anything else. The next degree is denominational exclusivism, where you think only your specific type of Christianity is real Christianity. This is where you get Catholics who think only Catholics are saved, or Orthodox who think only Orthodox are saved, or Calvinists who think only Calvinists are saved, or Baptists who think only Baptists are saved. This seems kind of weird to a lot of us, but to be fair, it was very common back in the day for different denominations to damn each other, but these days most Christians have gotten past that. And in the highest stage, you get into some very right-wing things like ethno-nationalism. The vast majority of Christians across the world have decided that racism is bad, but some people in this group are not so sure about that. Luckily, these people generally only exist on the internet and not in real life. So it's important to remember, just because someone's more liberal than you doesn't mean they're a Bible-hating atheist, or maybe just because someone's more conservative than you doesn't mean they're a total fascist. So when deciding where you fall on this graph, it's important to consider, where would Jesus be?